Welcome to Tony Martignetti Nonprofit Radio, coverage of the National Conference on Philanthropic Planning. We're in San Antonio, Texas. My guest right now is Emanuel Kallina. Emil is principal of Kallina Associates in Towson, Maryland. His seminar topic is Choosing the Right Letters for the Charitable Soup Mix. Emil, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Tony.
Pleasure to have you. The Charitable Soup Mix. I know there are SOs, supporting organizations, and private foundations, PFs. What else is in the soup?
Well, there are a number of other options. One is donor-advised funds. We call those DAFs.
Yeah.
And then there's also private operating foundations, and those we call POFs.
And people talk like this. Is that
they
right?
sure do. It cuts down on the length of the sentences.
All right. Like in planned giving, the PIF and other things, the CLT, CLAT, etc. Okay, as long as we know what's behind them, and that's what you and I are gonna talk about. What's behind these? Now, are they only for people who are earning at high levels or have high levels of assets, or can people of modest means take advantage of maybe some of these vehicles?
Yeah, Tony, that's exactly one of the initial questions that a charitable planner should ask a donor or / client. They should ask them, how much do you intend to give? And usually we try to make sure that a donor doesn't give away much more than 10% of their net worth, because we want to make sure that they have enough to live on given the economy and things that can happen, and allow for contingencies. But we talk to our clients and donors and ask them how much they intend to give, and if they're looking at giving during life and at death collectively less than $2 million, we go, well, you may be better off not looking at some of these esoteric vehicles like the PIF, the POF, and the supporting org and the private foundation, and instead look at something like a donor-advised fund, where you can make a gift to one charity, and then at a later point in time, you can determine, well, how you want those gifts to go. It could go to multiple charities instead of just one.
The donor-advised fund can be done for substantially less than $2 million. I mean, you could put just $1,000 into a donor-advised fund, can't you?
Well, most donor-advised funds have a minimum, and I think the lowest that most of them start off with is about $5,000.
Okay.
But they do allow incremental gifts after that are not as high. They might allow gifts as low as $500.
Okay. All right, so people of modest means then do have an alternative, and the audience for the show is small and mid-sized charities, so they may or may not have people who are apt to give and able to give at the $2 million or more level. But we'll talk about some of the other vehicles.
Okay.
Let's start with the donor-advised fund, since that's universally applicable. So now this is a charity recommending a vehicle to someone who's not familiar with it. So the donor would like to make a gift. The charity, you said in the first instance, needs to assess what, among other things, what size gift.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. And if the more a donor wants to give, typically that opens up the options for them to consider other vehicles that have different traits and attributes.
Okay. But let's start with the person who's most suitable for the donor-advised fund. Maybe this is just going to be a gift of $5,000 or $10,000. What would the charity explain to their donor about the donor-advised fund?
Well, typically with a charity that has created a donor-advised fund, they've done this to service the needs of their donors. And what happens is, obviously, if the individual donor was interested in making a gift to the charity outright, then and only to that one charity, they wouldn't even need the donor-advised fund. But if they wanted to make a gift, it was year-end, for example, and they couldn't figure out exactly what they wanted to give to, but they wanted to give to multiple charities.
Okay.
then the charity could say, well, we have a donor advised fund. Why don't you give us the money, and we'll decide in January how to dispose of it and how you would like other charities to participate in these gifts.
So the gift is made put into the donor advised fund today, but the decision of how to distribute that to charities is made sometime in the future.
So, exactly.
And the donor earns their charitable deduction when?
On the date of the gift to the sponsoring charity.
Into the donor advised fund.
Correct.
Yes. Okay. Now, what about again, small and mid-sized charities may not have set up their own donor advised fund? Where might they be able to connect with a donor advised fund, the charity?
Yeah, for those charities that haven't done it, there's no it's not a difficult process to do so, but they might decide to have their donor. Why don't you go to Fidelity, Schwab, Smith Barney? There's a lot of these funds that are set up by what we call commercial charities, and they are much more capable of administering a gift of $5,000 or $10,000 than a small charity might be. And the administrative costs and time and expense, especially if they don't do it on a regular basis, could best be borne by, let's say, Fidelity Gift Fund or something like that.
Right, which was the first, I think. Wasn't that the first donor advised fund,
Yes, it was.
the Fidelity Fund? And
yeah.
it's the largest now?
Yeah, they have, my understanding is they're pushing $5 billion in retained assets right now.
But still taking those $5,000 and $10,000 donor advised funds.
Correct.
Again, making the point, you don't have to have an enormous amount of money to put into a donor advised fund. Are there other alternatives for charities? I mean, do you ever see community foundations at all creating donor advised funds for the benefit of the charities in their community?
That's exactly right, Tony. Most community foundations are exactly that. They are a donor advised fund where individuals can give, and although most of the funds are expended within the community, some of these funds can go outside depending upon the charitable purpose of the foundation. They can go outside the geographic area. So you have Baltimore Community Foundation, for example, in my neighborhood back home. They can make a gift to a charity in New York if they so chose.
I think what concerns some individual donors and maybe even some charities is that the donor who has created the fund and put the money into it makes a recommendation to the organization or the company that is managing the donor advised fund. Explain how that works and why it's just a recommendation.
Well, that's correct. There have been two recent cases that make it absolutely clear that once the donor parts with the money, they have parted with the money, even though the charity running the donor advised fund may not spend the money appropriately. They may be even violating the law, but the money does belong to the charity that they gave it to. So it's wise to be careful what charities you give to that have a donor advised fund, because they may not spend it correctly.
And the charities in that definition of charity, the way you're using it, includes Schwab, Fidelity. Those are corporations, but their donor advised fund is a charity?
Fidelity has set up its own publicly supported organization called the Fidelity Gift Fund, for example, and Schwab and Vanguard and Smith Barney have done so, and those entities, or Stanford has got a donor advised fund, and I believe Harvard may also. I mean, there's some large places that are institutions that have it. The problem that has arisen that the consumer needs to be aware of is typically with a family-run donor advised fund, and the two most recent and famous cases where there has been alleged abuse was the National Heritage Foundation and the Fiji case out of Nevada, where there was alleged misapplication of the money.
Okay, so again, the donor makes a recommendation of the charity that they would like the fund, or charities that they would like their donor advised fund to be allocated to. And as we said, it's sometime after creation there isn't an urgency. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. What's the obligation of the organization managing that donor advised fund
Right.
to follow the recommendation or not?
Well, there's no legal obligation, which is the point.
Yeah.
But places that we did mention, the Fidelity, Vanguard, et cetera, and certainly Stanford and Harvard and some of the other places that might have a donor advised fund, they've been very good at following the donor's wishes, and there usually is not much of difficulty or complaints that I've heard over the last 25 years with those entities. The problems have arisen with small family-run donor-advised funds.
Okay, so the donor needs to be on the lookout for reputable funds.
Absolutely.
And so what's the level of scrutiny that the organization running the donor-advised fund is applying to the donor's recommendation?
Well, typically the charity receiving the gift from the donor is called a sponsoring organization.
Okay, SO. That's part of your charitable soup mix, isn't it?
No, that's supporting.
Oh, sponsoring. This is a sponsor. Your SO is not my SO.
Yeah,
okay,
that's right.
You're gonna kick my SO. Okay.
But the charity sponsoring the donor advice fund is supposed to make sure that when it gets advice from the donor and is ready to transfer money to another charity, that they check it out. They make sure it's legitimate. They make sure it's not a terrorist organization. They make sure that they have properly gotten tax-exempt status from the IRS, that they have gotten copies of determination letters.
Okay.
And so they have due diligence that's required in order to make sure that their distribution of the money according to the donor's recommendation is appropriate under the law.
Okay. And assuming the charity that's recommended by the donor meets that scrutiny, and that's not really a very high threshold. Are you a proper 501c3? Are you not a terrorist organization? Have you acquired your 501c3 appropriately? That's not a very high level of scrutiny.
No, it is not,
yeah.
and so it should not be a big deal.
Right.
So most of these funds, I'm unaware of any lawsuit, for example, that's ever come up with Fidelity Gift Fund or Schwab or Vanguard or Stanford or any one of these other places.
The reputable ones.
The reputable ones. So you need to be diligent as a donor and checking out who you're given to.
Okay. Let's move from the donor advised fund to what's a favorite of yours that's in your soup mix?
Well, I guess moving up, in terms of the next level of complexity that a donor would consider if they wanted to run a family charity, in effect. That fits into the category of private foundation,
mm-hmm.
and there are a number of rules that govern that. It costs about $2,000, maybe $2,500 a year to administer and run, so it's not inexpensive.
Right.
Furthermore, there are a lot of rules called prohibited transactions that must be followed and addressed. But in return for having this private charity, private foundation, a donor can have absolute control of it. A donor could be the sole trustee. And so other than following the rules that exist, it gives them great control over their charitable giving. They could make a gift today and wait until sometime in the future to make a distribution, but the law was revised back in 1969 to require certain levels of distribution, namely 5%.
Mm-hmm.
So 5% of the net fair market value of the assets of the private foundation have to be distributed out each year. And that's intended to make sure the money isn't just sitting and accumulating, that it is actually spent on charitable purposes.
So we have the same flexibility as with the donor advised fund, but greater regulation. Why would someone choose the PF, the private foundation, over the DAF donor advised fund?
Well, one thing that we've already addressed is the issue that the donor advice fund does not have to legally follow the recommendations.
So some donors are concerned enough about that to not choose that option.
Correct,
okay.
and some donors are very, they're prudent in the sense that if they were giving a lot of money, there's more risk than if they were giving a little bit of money.
Mm-hmm.
So if they were to give large dollars, like $1 million or $2 million, and looked at setting something up for the future, that down the road could provide an endowment for their charitable purposes, then they might say, well, I would rather do that in a private foundation than be in a situation where I would use a donor advised fund.
All right. Now you mentioned $2,000 to $2,500 a year to maintain the private foundation. Is there a large, high startup cost?
Well, usually
to create it?
Yeah, the startup costs, you have to file what's known as a Form 1023, and filing that with the government, the charges will usually run somewhere between $2,500 and $3,500 for the startup.
Okay.
And the maintenance charge of $2,000 to $2,500 a year is incurred to file what's called a Form 990. It's an annual report that a charity is required to file, and the accountants or whoever the administrator is of the foundation has to fill that form out. It's gotten very complex over the years, and even much more so in the last year or so.
Right. And is there a minimum dollar amount? Is this the $2 million or so or more that someone wants to give that would signal a private foundation being appropriate, or is that the right number?
Well, there's a lot of debates. The number I would not personally want to set one up for less than $2 million. Other people have said $10 million. Is an appropriate number to choose, because the rules are extensive, and you have to be very careful not to violate the prohibitions that exist, and you have to manage it and run it correctly. You have to fulfill all of the governance procedures. You have to file the annual report. You have to be careful of what kind of income you get, because it might be unrelated business taxable income, and you have to pay taxes on that. So there's a lot of different rules and a lot of different issues to be addressed. And so some people suggest a $10 million minimum. I think something in the $2 or $3 million range is quite reasonable, however.
Okay. And now in just the minute or so that we have left, let's talk a little, just briefly, about the supporting organization, the SO. What does that look like?
Well, the supporting organization is an entity that is organized and operated to support other charities. And so those charities that it supports have to be of a particular type. They have to be schools, churches, hospitals, community foundations. Could support donor advised funds, but they have to be public charities that they support.
And who creates a supporting organization?
Well, a supporting organization would be created by a donor who might have a highly appreciated stock from the sale of his company or a building that he or she was selling, and they want to put it into a supporting org rather than a private foundation. There are limitations on contributions to private foundations that 30% on cash and 20% on appreciated assets. But with a public charity, and a supporting organization is a public charity, the limitations are higher. It's 50% for cash and 30% for capital gain assets.
So the supporting organization then is another one where there's got to be a substantial, a six-figure gift at least.
Absolutely.
To make that a viable alternative.
Correct.
Okay. Emil, we have to leave it there. I've been with Emanuel Kallina. He's a principal of Kallina Associates in Towson, Maryland. We've been talking about choosing the right letters for the charitable soup mix, and we talked specifically about the donor advised fund and the private foundation, and a little bit about supporting organization. Emil, thank you very much for being a guest.
Thank you, Tony.
It's been a privilege to have you. This is Tony Martignetti, nonprofit radio coverage of the National Conference on Philanthropic Planning in San Antonio, Texas.